little bit of tech talk, answer some questions you guys might have out there about cylinder heads. And right now, let's pause just a moment here as we try to make sure that the Instagram feed is working. Those of you joining us on YouTube and joining us on Facebook, we appreciate that. Those of you just joining us now on Instagram, welcome. Michael Farrar from DSPORT magazine, and we're going to be talking a little bit right now about cylinder heads. What can you do with them? Why would you want to do something to them? And how much gains can you expect? Well, if we look back at a few of the articles that we've done in the past that have had some controversy, one of them has been the 5 worst engines of all time. These were the ones that we kind of picked out as engines that were, either really poor performers or just overhyped. And the Starion engine, I don't think anybody would ever defend it as being a great engine, the G54B. We've took that on last year. We've been doing development work on that. It's been a struggle, but we've made great gains. We've got probably the best team in the world working on it, but we should see some progress in that hopefully very soon. A lot of welding and rebuilding of the ports and stuff has to be done, and we'll see the progress and see what that can do for that engine. It's going to be key to making that thing make some horsepower. Now, the engine on the list that's probably one of the most overhyped is the Toyota 4AG. Yes, all you Initial D fans out there, the AE86, Hachiroku, all that good stuff. The engine's a piece of crap is pretty much the best way to describe it. I think that's putting it nicely in stock form as we got here in the United States. And as I learned, we pretty much got the worst of the worst iterations of the 4AG. So the version that we got here was a big port version. It had really big ports, and you'd look, you say, oh, that thing's great, has big ports. Well, no, it's probably the opposite effect of that. It had big ports. They were so big that they had to use an intake manifold that actually had an extra set of butterflies in there with 2 sets of runners to each cylinder in order to try to keep the airspeed up, so that they did everything they can to try to get the air into the cylinder. They probably would have put directions on there, but it didn't seem to work no matter what they did. Anyways, we got one of the later iterations of the cylinder head called the small port version. So if we look here, this is the adapter that lets us use some of the big port type intake manifolds and throttle bodies onto a small port head. So this is the big port side, and we see on this side, this is the small port. So that's kind of how it transitions, and you see how much smaller that port is, and you would think, well, going smaller, can that be better? The answer is yes, very much so. In fact, the small port engine that Toyota eventually did on the 4AG near the end of its life cycle was only available in the front-wheel drive vehicles, but it ends up being one of the better ones that you can get as a 4-valve engine, one of the best ones. So when we started with that the small port 4AG engine, we ended up with a situation where the factory valves themselves were really too small for any appreciable amount of performance. And to fix that, we had to go with bigger valves. And normally you go a 0.5 millimeter, maybe 1 millimeter over when you do a valve, a plus increased valve on a cylinder head. Well, no, on the 4AG, the valves were so small, I think we ended up going an additional 2 millimeters on the exhaust and 1.5 on the intake. In order to make that happen, you have to put in bigger seats. And you see here we had custom seats made for it. We did custom, actually these are SuperTech guides in there. We got SuperTech oversized valves. They make all the valves that are oversized, that are the same size as the Toyota Atlantic engine. And that's what we have here. And you can see these are the intake valves and kind of the size difference between the two. And over here we've got the exhaust valves. And just throwing bigger valves in a cylinder head doesn't do anything, actually. In fact, if you don't port the head for the bigger cylinder, for the bigger valves, you might actually lose performance. You might actually lose flow and velocity, and all kinds of things can go wrong. So you have to kind of do the whole thing as a package, and this was quite a headache. I'm not sure everybody who has a 4AG wants to go through all the headache, but let me talk about some of the results here. As we look back at the numbers here, we see really big gains. We're seeing here on the, okay, wait, this is the exhaust valve side. I'm sorry. valve size comparison. Let's talk about that first. You see the Toyota 4AG, how small the valves were here. 30.5 millimeter on the intake. For example, a B series is 33 millimeters, so a big difference there. And on the exhaust, 25.5 millimeters, 28 millimeters on a B series. So that plays a big role in it, and I think we have actually the flow numbers, if we can pop this up. The complete article, of course, you can get in the next edition of DSPORT magazine, but here, let's just take a look at some of the improvement here. Now, this was doing the seats, doing the ports, doing everything right, and the type of gains that we saw. 30% more flow on the intake, 40% more flow on the exhaust. And you notice we picked up flow everywhere throughout the lift range that we tested. It was tested right here on the Superflow the Superflow flow bench that we have right here. They do make dynos also, the SF750. So we went through and tested it all and got those numbers, and we're pretty happy with the results. Looking at flow numbers alone don't tell the entire story, so make sure if you're comparing flow numbers, they have to be from the same bench. You know, same bench to same bench. It's like dynos. Don't look at somebody's dynos that they ran on one machine and then running on a different dyno machine and getting different numbers. You cannot compare them. So you always have to compare numbers from the same bench. And you see here, you know, look at those percent gains. What are those numbers showing? And that's going to tell you how much performance you can potentially increase. Now that is if you did it without making the ports too big. If you want to just get numbers on a flow bench, it's kind of like putting on a T2 big turbo on your car to get that really big peak number, so you can be the, you know, the trailer queen that brags that they've got this dyno queen car that makes all this horsepower. Well, great, but does it even get down the track? Same thing happens on a cylinder head. You make these ports way too big, just like Toyota did from the start, and you can run into issues. They finally fixed it with making the small port version of the head. When you take that head, open it up for the bigger valves, you actually get a head that flows pretty damn good. So we're pretty damn excited to be using this cylinder head, which we did here at Club DSPORT. We're going to be putting this on a 1.6 liter 4AG that actually has a stroker kit in it. So I think we end up with closer, it's a 1.7, maybe close to 1.8. No, I think it's 1.7. 1.7 displacement, liters of displacement. So we'll have a little bit more displacement. We're just waiting on the cams that we can get. Basically, with this type of combination, it's NA, so the more cam you can get, if you can get enough compression cam in there, that's how you're going to make your horsepower. So that's what we're kind of doing with this setup. It'll be interesting. We haven't done an all motor build in quite some time. So to do it on a challenging platform like this, it's pretty exciting because we're pretty much going to make double the horsepower on this thing than we started. Plus, the cool thing about it, the owner of the car, he's been getting by. He built the car to kind of enjoy and race on the track, and he's had to use an 80 horsepower shot anytime he's been on a straightaway. And now, not only are we going to give him that 80 horsepower without the shot, but we're going to actually build the engine so he can put a 100 shot on it. So now he's going to have a Corolla out there on the track that's going to be surprising a lot of people. So it should be pretty fun. It's kind of an interesting project. You know, sometimes the things we hate become the things we love, and the 4AG, a good example of that. So this is an engine we're really excited about putting together. And do you guys right now have any questions about headwork? What you can do, what you should do, camshafts, anything of that nature? If you do, give us a question right now. And if not, I'll just go real quick on the last things that we're going to do with this head, give you some time to come up with those questions. So as I mentioned to you, we did all of the porting on this. We did the valve seats replacement, polishing of the chambers, everything and anything you can pretty much do to the cylinder head we've done on this, making this side of it, the ports and the fire face side of here, all good to go. So to finish off this cylinder head, what we'll need to do is get a spring and retainer package that's going to work well for the camshafts that we're choosing, and make any modifications to this side of the head to make sure we have the clearance for our high lift cams, to see if we can go to a shimless bucket type conversion so we don't have to deal with shims being spit out or anything like that when we take this engine to 10,000 RPM or whatever it'll go to, maybe more, and it should be a pretty fun project. camshafts right now we're waiting on. We're hoping to get a set of the Tomei USA camshafts. Oh, we do have a question. Go ahead.
So Josh Tosh, are new seats always necessary with oversized valves?
Not always. In fact, most of the time they're not. If you're going like a 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter, most cylinder heads do not need new seats for that. In fact, they can be a way to actually get the valve up off the floor of the chamber, because sometimes when you go to a larger diameter valve, you're actually coming on some fresh material, so the valve will actually sit up there in the cylinder head a little bit higher than it would be. As you use an engine, as you do more and more valve jobs on it, it tends to sink itself into the chamber, and by going to an oversized valve, now we're moving out the contact area a millimeter or whatever that oversize is, and sometimes that helps us bring that valve back up. So no, generally you don't. There are exceptions to the rule, but generally most heads, if you go to an oversized valve, you are not going to have to replace the seat, if it's a 0.5 to 1 millimeter. And a lot of times the manufacturer can let you know, the manufacturer of the oversized valves will let you know if you need to do that or not. But if you are going to do that, it is key in developing the port to work with that bigger valve. A lot of the Japanese engines, believe it or not, the valve size is a little on the big side. The Toyota 4AG is the opposite of that. It's definitely on the small side. Yes, question?
Can I offset the horsepower loss from 91 octane fuel with a big head, so more flow versus more compression from boost?
All right, I got lost there in that question, but let me see here. I'm going to try to figure it out. 91 octane, what do you got to do? So 91 octane, one of the challenges with that, of course, is it does have a higher propensity to knock than a racing gas or a higher octane fuel. How do you get around that? Well, on an NA motor, you're trying to make horsepower, and the only way you're going to do that is make it bigger, spin it faster, or get more power out of it for what you're getting into it. And in that case, the compression ratio, raising the compression ratio, you can increase the engine's thermal efficiency, so we get more power out of all the air and fuel that we're burning. But generally, raising the compression ratio has a higher propensity to knock. So how do you kind of balance that out? Well, it's tuning. You got to have a good tune, got to have an engine management system so you can tune it properly, and a tuner who knows what he's doing. The other part of that is, depending on what you choose for your camshaft, the piston, the deck clearance, all that's going to determine the engine's static compression ratio, which is when we measure it here with all of our tools, we can tell you, in this sense, in the laboratory, this is the compression ratio. But there's actually a dynamic compression ratio, and depending, the larger the cams you run, normally you can run more compression and you won't have a propensity to knock. It all depends though. There's a lot of factors in there, so cam timing also plays a big role. As you advance the cam, if you leave the exhaust there, maybe you have more of a propensity to knock because you're changing the lobe centers. All these things are a factor in it. But there are alternatives. There are things you can do to increase the or decrease the propensity to knock on the engine. Things like polishing the combustion chamber, getting rid of sharp edges and things of that nature, that can help. Also, you've got different types of fuel considerations. You can go flex fuel and run E85 or a mix of something, and that'll help out a lot. You can go water meth injection. There's a lot of ways you can kind of get around that propensity to knock if you have to run a higher compression ratio. So it's part of the balancing act we all do as engine developers and as tuners. Yes?
Good modifications in cams for turbo setups.
Good modifications in cams for turbo setups. So how does, I'm going to broaden that question out a little bit. How does it change if we're talking about a turbocharged engine versus a naturally aspirated engine? Well, what we talked about on a naturally aspirated engine, we don't have many choices to make more horsepower. We've got to make the engine bigger, or we got to spin it faster, or we got to make it more efficient in one way or another. Now, with a turbocharged engine or forced induction engine, we also have the option of just cramming more air and fuel in there. Using the turbocharger or supercharger, some type of compressor to just force more air in there, add more fuel in there, and go from there. About the old way of thinking, I should say, the old way of thinking was you want to make the engine different if it's for a turbo application or forced induction application versus a naturally aspirated configuration. So they used to sell, and probably still do, some companies sell turbo cams and all that kind of stuff that are supposed to be, you know, for an engine that's turbocharged or for an engine that's supercharged. Well, back in the days when, you know, you were tuning with a screwdriver and a carburetor, some of that stuff made sense. But with a actual real, you know, 21st century engine management system, that all goes out the window. You know, if you can make the engine breathe well in naturally aspirated form, converting what you have there to a forced induction form, it's pretty much, you know, a one-for-one, just move it on over and get the right turbo on there, get the right supercharger on there. It's more along that than, oh, I'm going to find this magic, you know, turbo cam for this, you know, combination. There isn't really stuff like that anymore, especially on some of the modern engines where you can actually vary cam timing and do all that. There's a lot more tuning to it. So I hope I answered your question there a little bit. If not, ask me something again and I'll kind of get there. One of the big differences with a turbo engine, you've got the world's ultimate Band-Aid. If you built an engine that has crappy cylinder heads, you've got the wrong cams in it, you got all these other things wrong, well, you crank up the boost. And some people just build, you know, their race engines are these engines that are just catastrophes that just run tons of boost and get away with it just because they build the engine to just survive that abuse, survive being punished with a poor tune and poor development. And there's plenty of those out there. So if you're looking for those, I'm sure you can find them. But if you want to avoid that, if you want an engine that actually makes the most power it can for a given boost level or for a given turbocharger and have a broadest power and torque curves possible, you got to do your work. You got to get the cylinder head working right, you got to get the right camshafts in there, and you got to get your tune right. All right, question.
All right, so the same guy that asked for the oversized valves.
Yes.
What's the process like to match the oversized valves flow through the cylinder head from your intake to your exhaust manifolds?
Intake to exhaust manifold. Okay, so I think he just kind of wants the whole air path start to finish. So I wish we had a cutaway of a head, or maybe we'll try to put something together to show you a little bit easier. But you know, when you're opening up a cylinder head and you're just putting a bigger valve in there, well, what happens is the seat where it's getting cut is getting opened up, but the throat and the bowl area and all this area behind it, it's still small. And you don't want, you know, especially on the intake side, you want the air to kind of get turned into the cylinder, get pointed in the right direction. So you don't want necessarily sharp edges, weird bends, weird radiuses and stuff in there where the air just gets, you know, puddled into a corner of this of the intake port or one side of the valve. You want it to get in there, get into the cylinder, and it's all about that. So shape is really what it's all about. Having the right shape. You know, in general, you want high roofs to make it easy to turn. You can widen the port a little bit down the runner. In most cases, the floor usually you don't touch much at all, and in a general sense through the entrance of the port you're doing that. And as you have the turn, you're worried about, you know, kind of transitioning from there into that valve job, and how do you kind of transition there in that bowl area. So certain things you can do and certain processes you have, the order of operations, when you pull out, you know, when you port, how you port and stuff. We do a few tricks here. You know, we do a pre-valve job. We cut a valve job on the cylinder head to kind of show us where we're going to need to end up with the porting before we port. We take out the guides before we port. We do all that, and then we put that stuff back in. It's a lot more work. Everything we do here is probably the most tedious way to do it, but it does actually take advantage of all the opportunities you have to kind of get the best end results. So you're basically following that process all along. If you're doing a cylinder head over and over again, you can experiment a lot with different valve jobs, different valve geometries. You know, even the shape of this valve, you know, how it is on the back of this valve, that's going to affect flow. You know, the shape of the valve, also the valve job itself, all of that is going to actually be a big influence on how the head flows. Now, typically that stuff has more of an impact at your lower lifts, but low lift is very important. You want to start getting the air into the cylinder as soon as possible, get that inertia, just have it carrying more and more, into the cylinder because it's all about filling the cylinder. Are we good? One more?
One question.
Yes.
Is that the 5 valve?
Is that the what?
The 5 valve.
No, we can count them here. There's 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this has the 2 intake valves, the larger ones, and 2 of the exhaust. Now, that's interesting though. The 5 valve, actually roll up to that because I don't remember all the notes, but we do talk about it in the article. I believe I did, or maybe I saved it for next article. I saved it for next article. Anyways, I remember a little bit about it. But Toyota made a 5 valve variant. Again, anything that they do in Japan, there's only like a 2% chance we'll get it here in the United States. So they basically kept this 4AG engine, and as much of a piece of crap as we got it in the early stages, they actually made it pretty cool near the end. They fixed a lot of the problems that they had originally and made the thing finally make 100 horsepower per liter and more. And so actually by the end of it, I believe they had, in Japan, you could get the car, it already had factory individual throttle bodies, like with 45 millimeter throttle bodies, and the thing made, gosh, I want to say it was 160 horsepower, somewhere up close to 153 horsepower. It was pretty respectable, so they made a lot of progress with it. Along the ways, they did try a 5 valve design. Now the 5 valve basically made 3 intake valves and 2 exhaust valves, and had a different valve train, of course, on the top to kind of get that all actuated and stuff. And it's a pretty good flowing head. Are you better off with the 4 valve versus the 5 valve? If you actually ported them out and did them on an equal basis, you probably make slightly more with the 5 valve. But it's more complex system. It's a little bit more challenging to find parts for. But I believe they actually sold the cars maybe in South Africa also, besides Japan, with the 5 valve engine. So yeah, it was a kind of bizarre thing, and they are out there, as a swap engine. A lot of people have been doing it, and then they complain that it makes nowhere near the horsepower that they said it did, and a lot of that has to do with the tune. Japan has, I think, 97 research octane number premium fuel there, so they have a bit higher octane fuel than we have, and the ECU and everything's tuned for that. So the guys that are only out there and just plop the thing in a car and do a swap, it's never going to run right. You really have to get an aftermarket ECU, get a good tuner, and dial the thing in, and then you can get the horsepower that they kind of claim out of it. All right. So I don't know if we got to all your questions, but just wanted to get a little bit of tech talk about cylinder heads in here before this one. Well, this one might be sitting around until we get those cams, but once those cams come in, that'll be going onto that engine. And yeah, tomorrow we're going to try a few different things. We're going to see how we can take some of this gear and take it different places, or figure out how to get some other feeds, from just being here inside the machine shop like we were today. And we'll see if that works. We got visitors coming. We've got, I think, some feature cars coming, different visitors throughout this week. So it should be fun. We appreciate you guys supporting us. Make sure, if you haven't done so already, you're subscribing to our YouTube, you're following us on Facebook, and doing blah, 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 and all the other things that you're supposed to do, I'm supposed to tell you to do. Please make sure you're doing that. If you'd like to support us more than that, please subscribe to the magazine, buy merchandise, do whatever you can. We can't work for any less than we're already working for, so you need to support us somehow. So we love you guys and look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. Have a great night.